Hello, my name's Duncan and welcome to one of my hot takes. This hot take is about branch junction anatomy. Let's get going. Okay, this hot take needs to start with some history of science. An anatomical model for branch attachment was proposed in an academic paper by Dr. Alex Shigo and published in 1985, which is about 40 years ago. A reproduction image of that model is shown on this slide. The basis of this old anatomical model was that the branch grew first in the growing season, and then the stem of the tree grew later in that growing season, leading to a sequence of overlapping, or what they were described as collars of sapwood, that kept the branch attached to the stem of the tree. Unfortunately, this anatomical model is incorrect. The proposed sequence of overlapping collars cannot be found by dissection nor by X-rays. In addition, there are a few logical arguments to be made against this model. Probably the most important logical argument is that the vascular cambium is not capable of producing the growth form that the diagram shows. The vascular cambium is a sheet-like layer of tissues sandwiched between the phloem cortex on the outside and the sapwood on the inside, and it cannot do a loop-the-loop in the way that this diagram implies. Almost as important, if overlapping collars are the way in which a branch is attached to the stem of a tree, how are two equally sized branches or stems attached to each other at a tree fork? The model is both improbable and inconsistent. At the time of publication, several other authors pointed out some of the inadequacies of this model in 1985, but it was still adopted by the arboricultural industry for some time. However, more recent science shows that this model should be rejected in favour of a logical one based on repeated dissections and X-rays. Let's look at this on the next slide. So, if that's not it, what is the current anatomical model for branch attachment? Essentially, there are two key anatomical features that are important for the mechanical strength of a branch junction, and these are in place to allow other sapwood tissues to be efficient in sap conductance. It's a form of trade-off in xylem, where some tissues are denser and more twisted, for example, to provide good bending strength, whereas other tissues are there to ensure good sap flow occurs. The two key anatomical features are these. First, if one member of the join, the larger diameter branch or stem if you like, is growing faster than the other one, the base of the smaller branch and the slower growing branch will start to become embedded into the tissues of the faster growing stem or branch. This is what we would probably just call knot formation, and by the knot becoming more and more embedded into the wood of the faster growing member of the join, this provides resistance to bending. It's like putting a nail into a wall. As it goes further and further in, obviously the nail becomes more secure in the wall. As the base of the branch gets occluded further into the stem of the tree, it becomes more mechanically secure. Well, the second feature forms in the axil of the join between the two branches, or the branch and stem, and it is in the form of twisted and dense wood that produces an interlocking wood grain pattern or patterns. This is called auxiliary wood, as it forms in the axil of the join. The interlocking patterns it produces provide substantial bending strength to the junction at its apex. The image on this slide shows a well-developed patch of auxiliary wood with twisting, turning wood grain formed within the axil of a branch junction in Turkey oak Quercus. Many scientific authors have reported findings, whorled grain and twisted grain in the axil of branch junctions of many species of tree. Now, this new model allows for flexibility of the anatomy of branch junctions. For a slow-growing and small diameter branch attached to a fast-growing stem of large diameter of a tree, the knot being formed as the base of that small branch is increasingly occluded into the stem, and it will provide most, if not all, of the bending strength at that junction. At the other extreme, where two roughly equal diameter branches are joined, or stems. At a fork, that's what we'd call it, there will probably be no embedded knot of any kind from one tissue to the other, and the junction will be greatly reliant upon the auxiliary wood formed between the two branches to achieve good bending strength and a sustainable structure. Most branch junctions lie somewhere in between these two extremes, with some embeddedness of the smaller diameter branch into the other branch or stem, and some formation of auxiliary wood in the axle of the join. This we can consider to be a sort of toggle effect. As one branch becomes smaller in diameter and slower growing than the other one it's attached to, more reliance and strength comes from the increased embeddedness. As the two branches of equal diameter continue to grow at the same pace with each other whilst attached to each other, so the development of more auxiliary wood will be needed to strengthen that join. Now, the specimen you can see on the slide has had its bark peeled off from it, so we can see the wood grain. If the bark was still there in place, you'll be able to see the position of the auxiliary wood formed, as where the auxiliary wood lies on the inside, so there is a bark ridge developing on the outside of the branch junction, which we'll see on the next slide. Okay, so quick hot take, but what have we learnt? Well, there's always scope to improve upon scientific models. Consider modelling of climate change back in the 1980s, or the models for treating cancer in the 1950s. All such scientific models have been improved over time through further science and more advanced methods of experiment and testing. Science moves on based on what is found by repeated and advanced testing. In the case of the 1985 model for branch attachment, it was an important model at the time. It strongly argued against flush cutting when pruning a tree, as this would cause more damage than necessary to the tree. However, unfortunately, that model was anatomically incorrect to the point that the model is not viable going forward in tree science. The new anatomical model for branch attachment is a far better match with the actual tissues one finds within branch junctions when you dissect them, whether it's a small diameter branch attached to a large stem or two branches of roughly equal diameter joining together, if one bears in mind that toggle effect that I described on the previous slide. Indeed, the old attachment model fails to explain how bark gets included into a branch junction and what that would look like anatomically, but it's easily explained and illustrated with this new model for attachment, for the included bark basically replaces some of the auxiliary wood at the apex of the junction, should that happen. I would end just by saying that the new model was only published a few years ago, so you will find many out-of-date publications and some resistance in the industry to accepting or teaching this new model currently, as the industry overall, the arbor industry, is somewhat conservative in nature. However, X-rays do not lie, and the usefulness of this new model of branch attachment is undeniable, so its acceptance in the industry is inevitable, until an even more detailed scientific model is arrived at. However, the model we have now is a good basis on which to build further features of a branch junction. So we have the right sort of base anatomy of a branch junction now if we want to understand its biomechanics, with which we can go forward with further science. It's just not possible to build upon that old model. The image on the slide, well, it shows a branch to stem attachment and a long and very clearly visible bark ridge running along the axle of the join. Under that bark ridge then will be formed the auxiliary wood, that twisting dense wood that is helping mechanically to keep these two elements of the tree attached together. It looks somewhat like a weld, doesn't it, on the outside of the tree? Someone's been welding two bits of metal together, and that's pretty much what is actually happening inside the woody tissues of the tree through the interlocking grain patterns and the denser wood that's being developed at that point, the auxiliary wood. To avoid conceiving that the bark ridge is not forming an important mechanical connection, try cutting down it. Cut down the line of the bark ridge with a chainsaw, and you'll soon find that the branch is not so well attached as it was. Oh, I could do another hot take about interpreting junction bark ridges if you wanted. Let me know if you'd like me to create that for you. Thanks for listening to my hot take. Talk again soon.